All right, welcome to another edition of Reptile Fight Club. I'm Justin Julander. I am the founder of Creativity Inc., apparently, according to my... No. With me tonight is Rob Stone, my faithful co-host here. How you doing, Rob?
I'm great.
Awesome. I am as well. This has been a pretty hectic week, but good times. So I am just very anxious and excited to get to Australia. That's the main thing that's been on my mind, and a lot of mental energy has gone into thinking about and planning and getting everything ready for that trip. So I'm very excited for it to get here.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be a ton of fun.
Yeah, for sure. About time we got together over in Australia. We've done a lot of trips over here, but haven't hooked up over there yet. So done some herping together there. So that'll be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's it's kind of a nice mix, right? Of places that we've been, new places as well. Mm-hmm. New spots within old places, all that different stuff. So yeah, I'm super excited for it.
Yeah. And I'm a little nervous. I guess I'm learning all these things. So I'm doing an extra week beyond what Rob and Eric and Keith and Teresa are doing. And so I'm headed over west to the border of Northern Territory and Western Australia, in the Western Australia side. So, and I'm finding that things close down there. So I'm a little concerned that I'm going to be stuck different places, but there should be plenty to do even with the areas that are closed. So I should have a good time down there. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it'll be interesting. I found out there's a couple of herpers living in Kununurra, so I may be able to go out and herp with people who know the area a little better and have found Glowerty in the wild. So that's kind of nice. The main goal is to see one of those around there and at least photograph it. Especially if we've seen them already in Northern Territory, because I imagine those types. Yeah, I imagine those are going to be split into two different species. I mean, if they did it with Pilbarensis, they're definitely going to do it with Glowerty. So,
yeah, those are much closer together.
Yeah,
Hammersliensis and Pilbarensis are much closer geographically.
Right. So. Yeah, I'm just shocked that it hasn't been done yet, because it seems like there's been, Sam Sweet and some of the others have studied
looked at them really closely.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd think they'd have collected samples and submitted them for DNA work or something by now. Yeah, kind of crazy. But
absolutely.
Yeah, there was some really weird looking ones in doing my research for the trip, like kind of on the Northern Territory side. What's the area? Anyway, there's one that almost looks like a lace monitor. Like it has really bizarre, like dark patterning and stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's some, and that's kind of a known phenotype from that area. So really weird looking Kimberley rocks from that area. So kind of a cool diversity, and hopefully,
absolutely.
I'm kind of looking for this to be kind of a goanna trip. Add some new species of monitor lizard to the have seen column of my list there. So get up at, over 20 species. I think I'm like at 16 or something like that. So
nice.
Yeah, should be nice to add a few more. And one should be a slam dunk. If I don't see Mertens on this trip, then I probably don't deserve to see him. So, yeah, I think I was talking with Alex on Messenger, and he's like, I heard on your podcast you haven't seen Mertens yet. So that should be pretty doable in a lot of different areas, So, yeah, I'm like, if I haven't seen him by the time I get to Western Australia, I probably don't deserve it.
Oh, my gosh.
So, yeah.
Oh, that's pretty good.
Exciting times ahead. Hopefully things will go well and I won't get stuck in the outback somewhere, all alone, right. all by myself. So yeah. Should be good. Should be a fun adventure either way.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, how are things going reptile wise for you?
All good. Had a litter of Puerto Rican boas born earlier in the week. Fit with the same timing. A couple interesting things with that timing as usual. Kind of that end of the first week into the second week of September. That's her normal timing to go. It's amazing how willing to fit into a routine they are. And I don't know whether that just reflects my particular conditions or it reflects them. It's probably the nexus of those two things. But as I've talked about several times, the thing that I've come to learn is in terms of if we're keeping stuff that really suits the conditions and how we keep within those conditions, that nexus, it really transitions from, hey, I'm trying to get these things to breed, to you see in the animals this natural inclination and willingness to do it on a specific routine. And I've seen that particularly with the Puerto Rican boas, where it's just, every other year, come April, the female swells up, starts developing these massive follicles coming out of the sort of the year of bounce back, and then the cycling, which is all the things, right? It's lights, humidity, feeding, all are pressing all the buttons that I do in my room. But then with those particular conditions, as they come out of that, in April, the males start going crazy and the females start getting massive. And it becomes one of those things where, as something that you can't sell, right, that has no commercial market to them at all, it's like the last 2 times, if not 3 times, it's been a function of, well, I might as well pair her up because otherwise this male is going to spend the next 6 weeks driving himself crazy. And she's probably going to, develop and throw slugs anyway. So that reproductive effort might as well be maximized rather than minimized. And I do think, we've seen it in captive reptiles, right? The more that they go through unproductive reproductive events, it does seem to have a negative health impact for them, right? The Komodo dragons, ultimately, that they wind up spaying those, for the most part, they'll spay those female Komodo dragons so that they stop throwing, bad eggs, or throwing some and retaining some and all these different things that, it seems like you're more likely to run into complications by sort of rejecting that natural cycle that has come on so strong that it's so obvious you can't miss it. And you just say, okay, I guess I need to abide, right? Rather than sort of trying to repress this, especially in the context, obviously, if you had that as a singular pet animal, it is what it is, right? But in the context where I have a male that's going to drive himself crazy for the next 6 weeks, I might as well sort of put that together, and then it's just okay. Who would like some free babies? Unfortunately, it looks all set up and good to go for this year, so I think we're good on that account.
That's good.
So, I don't know how excited Dustin is, but Brandon is certainly excited, and so between the two of them, I'm gonna send a whole handful down to them, and amongst other people that have expressed interest or whatever. So it's really good. It'll actually, it turns out well or whatever. Maybe that's the benefit of biannual breeding, right? Is that it's harder to overproduce the non-commercial market for them. But so that's good, exciting. The funny thing was, so that makes the 4th time in 8 years, so split every other year each time that she's had 4. So in 2018, it was 14 live babies, no slugs. 2020, it was 14 live, 2 slugs. 2022, 14 live, 2 slugs. This year, it was 15 live, no slugs.
Wow.
Totally wild.
So consistent.
And for Jeff stuff, they have that great West Indian Boas website. Each time when I have a litter, he says, hey, can you weigh and measure those babies, and give them those details to inform the website, and I think some of that stuff is still stud book involved and whatever. So it's, the details around that is more important than they are it's not just, for my own note card someplace or whatever. It actually is going to something. And the interest of that is, so I did that for this litter, and save having, so it had one more. On average, they were smaller, both in length and weight, but if you took the weight of all the babies from this year compared to the weight of all the babies from 2022, it was only 4 grams less. So the collective mass at I think it was something like 208 grams collectively, whereas in 2022, it was something like 212 grams. It's just wild, the consistency.
That is incredible.
Yeah, just total consistency. There was one more, live offspring, so you just see it dissipated. I think it was basically one baby short of the length. So I did also look at the cumulative length in centimeters or whatever, and it was like one average baby's less, in terms of the total length of babies that she had produced. But functionally, it's exactly the same each of these, over those 4 reproductive cycles over 8 years. Just that consistency is amazing. The timing is amazing. All those litters are within 2 weeks, when they're being dropped. And it's just, it's really impressive and amazing. It speaks to an amazing snake, and I do think it says something for consistency of that animal, if not that species, within my room, of saying like, okay, obviously, I was talking to Dustin Smith, who I hope to have on the podcast. He's out at the North Carolina Zoo, and they do a lot of West Indian boa work, including species that aren't otherwise in captivity here in the States, Virgin Island boas, things like that. Cool. And he was asking me, hey, what does that look like? And do you get good babies, healthy babies, or are you trying to induce breeding? And I was like, no. They want to get, it's very clear. It's not, but so often, right? So much of our conversation is about, well, how do we induce them to breed? And it's like, I think that I know we've been talking about it over the trips of the last year to 18 months of saying like, I've seen it, of saying, work with the things that work in your conditions, however you make those. And that might be minimal inputs, or it might be a lot of inputs, right? If you're keeping chondros in Colorado or whatever, but to me, the part that's so instructive is that it's like, if you're working with things that naturally fit into your situation and the way you want to keep them, right? Because the amount you're feeding them, what you're feeding them, how often you change them, clean their enclosures, do the water, all these things, right? There needs to be a nexus between all those things. But when there is, it really, I'm not claiming it's almost like claiming no credit, right? In the sense of saying, it just so happens to be that these species work really well with where I live and how I like to keep snakes. So that, I know Nipper, has worked really hard to try and produce Jamaican boas, very similar.
Uh-oh, I hear nothing. I don't know if it's still recording, but this is we were worried about this. Rob was having connectivity issues before we started here, so he can probably hear me, but I don't hear him, so I don't know if anything's recording. I guess Eric can cut out dead air if that occurs, but hopefully Rob will be back here soon. If he's not hearing me talk over him. Good old challenges of modern convenience, right? Yeah, I guess I can kind of fill the void here with some chat about my own reptile room. I'm getting a bunch of Antaresia babies going, and that seems to be progressing pretty well, especially for the Eastern Stimsons. They take off pretty quick and easily. The Western Stimsons are a little bit more of a challenge, but they're not too terrible. And then the Pygmies are, they're a challenge for sure. And hopefully I'll have a few of each of these species ready to go here soon. Unfortunately, lost my children's and spotted python clutches this year, so that was kind of a bummer, but what do you do? So I don't know if any of that got recorded, but we'll see. We did lose Rob. He's not on the screen anymore, but it says it's still recording, so we'll keep going here. Oh, here's Rob back, so let's see if we can hear him now. But you're back. Can we hear you? Can you hear us? Can you hear me? I guess there's no us here.
Hello.
Okay. Now there's a bit of a delay between your video and audio, but it's a little...
Yeah, hold on 1 second.
Okay. It looks like you're back going, but yeah, I was just talking about how things are going in my reptile room and what's up, but yeah, things are moving pretty well. And I got some new caging set up, and that's been fun to give some of the animals quite a bit more room and area, more naturalistic keeping type thing. So hopefully that'll make a difference in the quality of their clutches. Mostly I'm speaking of the womas, but I've also set up some jungles and inlands in some of these larger cages, and plan to get a few more of these here soon, get them set up as I'm able. But yeah, I'm liking the larger cages. The more, I can see them better. They're more visually, they're out and about in their cage. I've kind of given the Womas a little more naturalistic setup where they have kind of a underground burrow system type setup in their cage. So I put a corrugated tube into a Rubbermaid container and then kind of filled it in a little bit with some foam and fake rock, so they can kind of climb around in there and have an artificial burrow nest chamber type thing. So we'll see how that impacts the success of this next season of breeding and egg production and stuff. So I've got lights for heating in there, so they're heating up more naturally. So they'll have kind of a cool down here pretty soon, but we'll see how it goes. But it's kind of exciting when you switch things up, but you never know if it's just going to tank everything and you're going to have worse outcome than you did previously. But that's where we're at. So I had a question for you regarding the boas, the consistency of the Puerto Rican boas. Are you keeping things like food intake and feeding cycles and things like that consistent as well? I mean, do you think that's part of the consistency, or do you just kind of feed them when you think they need a meal and not really have much of a schedule or a certain amount that you're feeding them? Just more of a how they
no
about it.
Yeah, that's fair. No, I do think it's consistent in that I haven't changed my approach over that time, but it's not consistent in the sense of the amount or the intrinsic amount, right? It's not sort of, every week I feed them X. Not at all. It's all responsive to how they're acting, how they're interacting, what I happen to have on hand. But it is the same style of like, what is the prey size that I would feed? How am I probably reacting? I do think there has been good consistency on that aspect, at least, from 2018, 2017, whatever it is, to say I've kept them basically the same way and interacted with them the same way of saying, okay, this is the signals you're giving me and this is how I'm responding accordingly. I don't think I've dramatically changed what I'm doing over that time, but yeah, it's interesting for sure.
I always wondered how that works out and how just intake and kind of things like that. I think it was Gavin Bedford that looked at intake of how many mice it takes to keep a python doing its normal duties, and for like a Stimson's python it was like 20 mice a year or something like that. I'm like, okay, that's only a couple reasonable. Mice. Yeah. Less than 2 mice a month. So doesn't take too much. And I'm sure part of the year. And I kind of wrote that down as a future topic. Like, should we be trying to replicate hard times, and if that has an impact on longevity or overall health or things like that, on our snakes, if we're just giving them optimum conditions all the time, optimum food all the time, if that's how that's impacting them. But I don't know.
Well, and maybe to that point, right? Part of this is, to finish the thought before my, problems with the internet of the last day cropped up, was just going to, to complete the circle was, these discussions with Emperor is working really hard to try and produce those Jamaican boas. Mm-hmm. And it's like, on the one hand, I have lots of advice, and on the other hand, I have no advice, because I effectively don't do anything. They show a clear willingness to produce, and I guess I'm visualizing that and then responding accordingly by pairing them up or whatever. But it's all those underlying conditions in my underlying conditions that are making it make sense and making it work for me. It's not that it's not some specific necessarily transferable underlying condition that I'm doing and could recommend. It's okay. What would my answer be? It would be, okay, move to Colorado, feed them the way that I do, and, put the lights on that I do, the way that I do, and whatever. And to your point that, to bring this into the conversation that you were just highlighting there, I would say that, like, for everything that I have, there's probably 6 months of the year where they don't eat. It's not a straight bake, and it's not an entirely completely shut off, because the amazing thing is, I am just, again, with room natural conditions and things, in starting in November through February into March, and it can, same as Utah, we can have a random drop day or whatever, is, the room can be in the mid 60s. And the amazing part is, particularly when they're not being fed, all of those West Indian boas, frankly, everything that I have, will come out. It will be sitting out at 65, totally ready to nail something.
Yeah.
They'll sit there every night, seeing if something will come by. And it's only after maybe 2 weeks of nothing, within those 2 weeks of hunting with no success, that maybe they'll tuck away for a week or 2 weeks, and they won't come out, and then they'll try it again, and you'll run through another 2 weeks. And sometimes within that cycle, then it'll be, okay, I'll toss them a mouse, which, for a 4.5, 5 foot snake is hardly anything, an average size carpet, which is functionally, sort of the niche that they fill. Yeah. It's like, that's basically nothing. And okay, I'll toss them one, and then maybe the next day I'll give them another, maybe I'll do 5 days in a row, and then it'll be 6 weeks before I do it again, or whatever. But so I think maybe I guess what I'm saying, nothing has changed, is I'm not responding differently to their body condition and things like that. But yeah, it's definitely not tracked. It's not on a schedule of any kind. It's not even a hard, okay, I absolutely don't feed them between X and Y. It's just, what are they doing, and trying to respond. What are they doing? What is the room doing? What seems appropriate? What do I have to feed them? And, go accordingly. But yeah, in general, they mostly eat in, I would say, April through mid-June, and mid-July through now, more or less. And other than that, they're not getting all that much. It'll just be based on how they react and how they look. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. We'll toss you one here or there. I've seen it. The crazy part is, and I was thinking about this today. So one, I don't know how much it's been noted, because I'm mostly off of Facebook, but so this year, Travis Wyman has gotten 2 litters of Solomon Island tree boas, which, other than the litter that I had, and maybe the litter that the fellow who's up in the North Midwest, who worked, now has his own deal, Ryan McVeigh. I'm not sure whether that litter was a gravid female that had come in. Yeah. I'm not sure what that litter turned out in terms of like healthy babies that started and did well or whatever, but neither here nor there. But the point would be, other than mine, certainly I haven't seen a genuine U.S. captive bred litter after mine, which was in 2019, I believe. So, and Travis had 2 females go in the same year. Wow. And it was really cool. So throughout the process, he was kind of asking, I could be a resource to him in terms of, because I didn't have a resource. There was no, like, how long do they even gestate for? And we're talking on those, mine came up just short of 7 months, and his dates were similar, but at least the first one, which is the one I had I think he told me it was maybe 10 days short. So it would be like 6 to 6.5 months, something like that. Wow. But totally incredible. I mean, I think he's sitting on 20 to 25 of them across 2 litters, which is going to be some work for him, but, pack a lunch. But nonetheless, it's like, wow, the incredible thing that I saw with those, and that I'm even seeing with the ones that I have now, is those females, they just sort of physiologically, and I'm sure it represents their natural conditions, right? And so the females get much larger than the males, and I think they eat rodents in the wild. Whereas the males, I don't think ever in the wild get beyond sort of a lizard eating stage, which is why when they fast, they can be harder to get back onto mice, is because they're programmed to eat lizards their whole life, as opposed to the females that gain size and are ready to transition at some point in their life. The part that's wild is seemingly those females will have years where they basically aren't interested in food. It'll just be a season of like, just not super into it, and what I've seen is that they'll have sort of that off or fallow year where they might eat less than 10 mice over the year. And we're talking about not small snakes, 4 foot and maybe 2.5, 3 inches, across, something like that. And they look none the worse for wear, which is part of the thing that's incredible, right? We talk about the perpetual Matt Somerville, idea of like, oh, it was fat, the brown snake that was fat on 3 mice a year or whatever. But Yeah. So they look none the worse for wear. They'll have this fallow year. And then the next year you can just see it in them that they're ready to eat. And it's like, I think that certainly the year before I produced them, 2 years before was a fallow year. I think she probably had certainly less than 10 mice, and not even like jumbo adult mice, maybe like hoppers to large hoppers, something like that. And then the next year she ate, I want to say like 60. So she went from having like 8 one year to 60 the next. And then then she was cycled and ready to go. And, I'm kind of seeing it in their reactions this year of saying like, okay, I think this was kind of a fallow year for them. And so I'm wondering if next year they'll have a boom year and then they would be ready. So they're not ready to cycle this year, ready to start that 9-month process basically between the start of breeding, because that's 7 months after the post ovulation shed in my case. So it really is a long time, and they don't eat at all during that time. So it's yet another basically a year where they don't eat. And the crazy part was, so when she did have those babies, man, they look rough, because at that point it had been 11 months without eating, basically. Wasn't eating while being paired in the start of pairing, and then through that whole process. And then she didn't eat until she had shed after she had them. So it's just, truly wild. And so in the wild, I would think they probably are producing every 4 or 5 years, especially given the apparent density that species lives on those islands.
Yeah.
I mean, they're probably breeding every 4 or 5 years to have the resources to have the boom year. The fallow year is probably the normative condition. And then they have the boom year, and then they go, and it's going to take 4 or 5 years before they're even in the state to take the boom year and be ready to go.
Yeah. That's just incredible. Like, kind of just blows your mind thinking about, all the complexities and things that can go into this, and, how can we best serve the animals and, also maintain maybe a productive collection, things like that. But that's really interesting information.
And I think that, as far as I remember, because it would go kind of further back, right? A part of this is it's easy to lose track of stuff, but I believe that Travis had expressed the same thing of having previously seen sort of fallow years, or what I would call a fallow year in terms of their willingness to feed. And I think, at least for one of them, he had expressed, this seemed like a boom year. And it's like, well, I think that's the cycle, right? Is it's mostly fallow years. Then if you get the willingness to take a boom year, that's when you have a shot at it.
Yeah. That's really cool. And I mean, you need to pay attention to your snakes. If you weren't keeping a close eye, you wouldn't notice that behavior of, hey, feed me, and then, hey, feed me again. And, and compared to before, where they were just kind of like, I'm not hungry. You have to be able to read your snakes and know your snakes, or else you're not discovering these things. You're not seeing this pattern and the consistency and stuff. So that's really interesting. Yeah. Very cool. Yeah. So many things we don't know. I guess that's the exciting thing, is there's a lot to discover and a lot of neat things we can find, even as lowly keepers in a captive, collection,
absolutely,
private collection. And I've been thinking about zoos a little bit lately. I watched MJ's tour of Reptilandia just to kind of see an update, and he went through pretty much the whole place, and man, what a cool facility that is, and how excited I am to get there at some point. I'm honestly, I'm kind of waiting a little bit till everything's
right.
More...
Not everything is done at this point. There's like, they have multiple buildings, and it's kind of like this one's now done, and whatever.
And then they'll move into the next one. But man, those enclosures are really cool. And that was kind of what maybe spurred the topic of today's debate or fight, whatever you want to look at it as. But where MJ kind of made the comment, like, they had a huge enclosure and like had several emeralds in there, and whether or not that would be a more interesting route to take, what benefits you might see having a room size enclosure with a few animals in it versus 10 single enclosures with an individual animal in it. And what kind of discoveries or what kind of hardships or downsides there would be for each of those ways of doing it. So I thought we'd kind of talk about that today, if that works for you, and talk about kind of benefits of keeping the same, even keeping different species together, or multiple species exhibits like they have at Reptilandia, large enclosures with several of the same species, and maybe a couple different species in there as well, versus keeping individually in smaller, manageable sized enclosures. So let's flip a coin. What do you say?
Okie dokie.
All right. Let's see if your luck is back on this week. What do you got?
I got tails.
It is heads. Sorry to tell you. Yeah.
Regret to say.
Yeah. I think I'm going to go with the big, like, zoo type enclosure with room sized enclosure with lots of the same species in there. I think that's got a lot of cool aspects, and something I've thought about a long time, even though I don't really have an enclosure like that. So I don't have personal experience. I don't know that many people do. And, but I think, that's kind of a goal for down the road. Maybe when my kids all move out and I have a lot of extra rooms, and maybe my wife will let me take one of those rooms, or maybe if I thin out my collection, I'll devote half the reptile room to a single enclosure. But, so, and I'm going to go ahead and kick it off, I guess. So that's, kind of a dream maybe all of us have as reptile keepers, is like, I want to have a room that I can walk into and have like a bearded dragon and a frilled lizard and a skink, or, something like some of these mixed type enclosures that I've seen, in different zoos or even private, collections. But I think one of my favorites was in the zoo in Perth in West Australia. They have a big kind of open top, they just have glass sides, but it's this huge footprint, of a enclosure. You can look at pictures online or whatever of the Perth Zoo reptile house, but they have this big enclosure in the middle of the room that it's really long, and it has like Western blue tongues and Centralian blue tongues, Western blue tongues, shinglebacks, frilled lizards, I think a few bearded dragons, different species of dragon in there. And, you could just kind of walk around and just watch the behavior and the activity and cool things like that. So, and I think too, with, certain species, that maybe cover lots of distance in a day. I mean, when we were in Western Australia, we followed tracks of shinglebacks for, several hundred meters or a quarter of a mile or something across the desert. And then you'd finally find the pair chasing each other down or something. So they're moving quite a bit. And, I'm sure certain times of the year they're not moving all that much, or they're staying a little more stationary or ruminating or hibernating or something, or estivating, whatever they're doing. But times of the year they're moving quite a bit. So, that wouldn't be a bad thing to give them that more space. And then you can kind of watch the interactions between the different animals and between the different species and things like that. Now, obviously that comes with increased responsibility to pay attention and make sure that things aren't going downhill. When I was in Central Australia at the Alice Springs Reptile Zoo or Reptile Park, they had an enclosure with a couple of shinglebacks, and man, these things were just going at it. Like they were attacking each other, and you could hear them crunching on each other's, their bony plates, the big scales that they have. And I mean, they were trying to beat each other up pretty good. So I went and told Rex, and he came out and separated them and moved them somewhere else, at least one of them. But, there is some kind of responsibility there. But I think the opportunity to observe those interactions, and if they have enough room, if they have place to get away from each other, maybe that's not the worst thing. That's kind of more naturalistic, where in the spring, males probably do a little bit of battle or do try to fight over females. And we see it in all sorts of species where, when you have male combat or something like that, and that helps ensure that the strongest, healthiest animals are the ones that are doing the breeding and things. You just have to have a place for the losers to get away from the winners, I guess. And that can be a challenge in its own way. But I don't know. I just think that would be really neat to sit and watch that behavior. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, naturally, as an opening statement, there's a ton there. So let me go kind of in the order that, that jumped out to me from what you had said. I think the first thing, right, you said the Perth Zoo context, and it sounds like the Alice Reptile Center as well. The first question if we're talking about a big space is, can you actually see them, right? Mm-hmm. And it sounds like in both those instances, the answer was yes, at least in general, right? Maybe it has the board, classic board that says these 15 things are in the cage, right? Yeah. It reminds me of being over at Bob Ashley's place, right? Yeah. In this garden, at least at one time, at the time the sign was made, you could see these 16 things, and who knows, maybe the answer, if you can't find that 16th one, is, oh, actually I haven't had those for 3 years, or whatever. Yeah. And so it's not, you can't, or it could be that, no, it's there. It's just its habits. And there is the provision of those environments where they can totally tuck away and you really can't find it. Right. Yeah. So, I think that's always kind of, the operative question. Well, and even taking a step back, I think the real question is like, who's the audience? Are we talking about a zoo, context where we have general public people, or is this you in your house trying to have that enjoyment, right? So in terms of, I do think the greatest utility for on the one hand, to me, the greatest utility for this would be if it was your personal collection, right? And you could be sort of sat there and you have all day to take it in, right? And it's maybe that is your collection. This room is your collection, and it's literally your entire effort into the pursuit is really just maintaining that room, maintaining and enjoying that room, and really getting to experience it. Then, I mean, even if the really reclusive thing, you only see him. What are the beautiful little Tribulinotus type FNQ skinks that you know what I'm talking about? Prickly or exactly, prickly forest skink. Maybe those in that context, right? Those are the sorts of things that to see them, you'd have to flip them, or maybe once every 6 months, one is poking out, so you could just barely see it, or whatever. If that's in your house, that's really enjoyable. In the context of, if those, well, it doesn't sound like, given the constraints, the environmental constraints we touched on before, of either the Perth or Alice setup, those prickly forest skinks probably wouldn't do well in the aridity of either of those environments. But, in that context, put that over in Cairns, like that probably isn't a great addition to that display, because their public might spend their whole time getting frustrated about never seeing them and just saying like, oh, they don't even have them, or whatever. Whereas being in a small enclosure that might be small relative to sort of their wild type land usage is going to be really restricted. But, you at least you either see them, and maybe that even lends itself to a super small cage where there's actually like I'm picturing a glass tank with like subterranean visibility into so that they feel covered, and maybe you got the one-way glass sort of situation, so they feel protected, but you can see them, that sort of thing. Maybe that's the best way to keep that species,
or reverse night cycles or things like that, where nocturnal species you can see them during the day because you go in a dark room and they flip the light and dark schedules.
Flipped them on. Absolutely. Those are the sorts of things that I guess would be a consideration, just in terms of what are we putting in the group. Is it going to be and what's our purpose, right? As a zoo, I know Terry, right, was always a big advocate, because he is pretty much in charge of the collection in terms of what they're working with or keeping or displaying. That he had some statistic, and I'll make it up now because I can't remember it exactly, but it was some amount of time less than, it was 6 seconds, some single digit amount of time that people are willing to invest looking at a cage to find the animal on average when they come to a zoo. So in those, the good aspect, positive aspect of one of those big communal tanks is that almost certainly there will be something that they will be able to see. Now, if they really hope to see the prickly forest skink, then they almost certainly will never see it if it's not kind of narrowly situated to be visible.
Yeah.
So yeah, kind of that's my first thought. Who's the audience? Can you actually see them? And it's it sounds like for the most part what you described with Perth and Alice, the answer was yes. They've done a good job of picking things that are out that you can see. You're not sitting there going, oh man, I know you. I'd really love to see the Western blue tongue or the Centralian blue tongue or whatever it is, right? I'd love to see that, but you can't see it. I think Alice, right, had mollusks, right, and so if those were in a multi-species setup, but in a way that they were being repressed by something else they were interacting with, that would be the biggest bummer, because there's no place else really in the world you could go see that.
Right.
So it's like, man, I hope if you have those communally, you better have designed that correctly so they're not being impacted by other things and they're not out, because that's going to be a huge bummer if we can't see the mollusks at the one place you can go see them, because they're afraid of if they're also in there with sand monitors or something.
Yeah. Well, I think that was kind of one of the things that was brought up on this Reptilandia tour, was the fact that, with these huge enclosures, people may not see what, you're trying to display.
The interactions amongst them.
Yeah.
Well, or even catch the sort of the very often very subtle, right? It's one thing if you would say, okay, in my, non-existent hypothetical where you have mollusks in with, flavies, that you have a flavy with a mollusk in its mouth, right? Okay, that's a very clear indicia that maybe we should do something else. If on the other hand, the interactions between those two is much more subtle, if it's not your singular, your collection as a singular entity, as a singular cage, then you might not actually be observing that stress is even happening. You might be seeing it in terms of, oh, well, they don't seem to be thriving, right? Maybe they're not feeding as well as you would anticipate. You're not seeing what you would presume would be normative basking behaviors, any of these different things, or you don't see them at all. You might imply that, but that requires a lot of, A, attunement to what's happening, and B, just the time to even be attuned, right?
Yeah.
So,
I think in a lot of those cases, like they had flavies in the building, but they were in a separate, walled off section of that large,
right.
So like maybe they could
even be in the same thing, but a little separate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, you obviously have to pay attention to which species are going to do well together. And I think that was kind of one of the conclusions for Reptilandia, is like, we put, 4 or 5 different species, and you might see some in this section of the cage, and others are maybe up higher, and others prefer on the trees, and others prefer on the rock background, that kind of thing. So they're trying to fill the space with different, trophic levels of species that are filling different niches. And so I think that's kind of the answer, for a big zoo or a big enclosure space like they have at Reptilandia. Now they also have a lot of kind of typical, smaller zoo enclosure type things for species that may not play well with others, or that may have more difficult to meet care requirements that need, specific humidity or things like that is going to be more difficult in a room size enclosure versus, that's a couple stories high versus a more controlled environment. And that probably goes over to your side, to the level of control gets more difficult the larger you get, and the more species that you include in that area. That can be a challenge. And I think, there is a lot to be said about, previous experience of different zoos and with different species and mixed species enclosures. Like, I'm sure they've learned some things the hard way, and other things have kind of worked out, so they can spread that, information to other zoos. I know Steve Sharp was telling me something interesting. He said, there's kind of maybe a push to move zoos towards more of a museum type thing rather than a, self-guided thing. You'd go in and you'd have a zookeeper walk you through, kind of point out things in the enclosures. So, you're taking away that frustration or that 6 seconds or whatever it is, and you're actually educating them. They're able to see the animal, because the zookeeper knows exactly where it is or what's going on with it. And I think treating it more like, that where you're kind of quiet, you're listening to somebody tell you about it. You're not, your kids aren't yelling and screaming and running around and climbing, and banging on the glass, that kind of thing. It's more of a controlled, tour type thing rather than a free for all. And I thought that was an interesting thought, you wonder how people would take that. 'Cause I'd be like, well, I want to sit and look at this animal for a little longer than the tour is allowing, and if they don't let you in there on your own or something, that'd be kind of crazy. The other nice thing is when people that work at the zoos, that will take you kind of behind the scenes or whatever. When we were at the Alice Springs Desert Park, I met one of the guys that worked there, and he took me right to the Moloch cage, and we went out, and he pulled them out of wherever they were and lined them up for me so I could take some pictures. They weren't the most naturalistic photos, but they're like a line of 4 Molochs in a row or something. It's
the only person with that photo in the world.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of fun to see them, but yeah, it was kind of a little different than the experience I was expecting. But at the same time, we saw the ones at Alice Springs Reptile Park that were just out in the enclosure on exhibit. You could see them pretty well, and actually, put your camera down at face level and take pictures and stuff. It wasn't like they were trying to keep you out of there or anything. And then there were a couple inside in enclosures. I think one was in with maybe I'm remembering wrong, but it seemed like one was in with a skink or something like that. It was like climbing on top of it or something like kind of cool. But I don't know. There's those. I guess if you have several different species in a very large cage, you have better chance of seeing something, out and about, especially if you're coming at different times of year, different times of day, or you're going to see different activity and different animals out and about. So that's kind of exciting. It gives you a reason to keep coming back somewhere. Now that doesn't necessarily play well if you're flying across the country to go once, or once every 5 or 10 years. But for the locals, I'm sure, a season pass would be a cool thing to be able to go in there and see different things at different times.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we've hit on it, right? Really the function of, from a potential negative, potential downside of increasing the number of animals or even the space, as you highlighted, is just that it increases either the interactivity amongst those animals or the variables, right, that are happening in terms of whenever you increase space, it's there's a positive and negative, right? It's that much harder to change the static point. So it depends how much the Alice Springs Reptile Park, they don't have to, or Desert Park, they don't need to change to the extent they're keeping red center critters, right? Yeah. It doesn't need to be all that different, especially outside, as long as presumably the presumptive condition is they're keeping any sort of potential predators out, and that they're giving sort of access to the micro conditions that allow them to survive in those otherwise really harsh areas, right? So that you're kind of taking on that burden of, hey, we got to make sure that we have suitable burrows and whatever other conditions are necessary to get them out to have them survive through the hard part, right? It's not bringing up to the good part, it's surviving through the hard part. And just interactivity, which naturally brings me to sort of dart frogs, right? I was just listening to the on Amphibicast. It's an older episode, but he was talking to someone who's the focus of the episode is on golden mantellas, old school frog guy. And ultimately, as it often does, it turns into a conversation about sort of mixed dart frog species tanks and how that's generally disfavored amongst the dart frog hobbyists, because those are species, at least if you're talking about species that are capable of hybridizing, because then those offspring are really problematic, particularly that hybridizing, if you're not willing to sort of, ethically deal with what you've then created, whatever that looks like in your context, particularly in things where we're talking about they're the same species, but they're from different geographic forms and all this stuff. The fidelity to that is really important to that community, and that's sort of foundational within that community. So as such, they, for the most part, with mixed species things, either they're looking things as you say, that are on different trophic levels, tree frogs with dart frogs, maybe if they're at a sufficient size where you won't run into an issue with them, one size consuming the other, depending on their sort of life cycle or life stage or whatever. that's an obvious, potential implication, and just the conditions necessary. It's one thing maybe to be able to keep them in that way, but certainly the conditions to breed them are often quite different. We're talking rain chambers versus just sort of a perpetual high humidity, high food availability, and they're just sort of perpetually going, are they seasonal or are they constant based on satisfaction of conditions, right? Those drivers could make the conditions that you need to have in there. And are you trying to reproduce them, or is it just visual? That being said, man, those dart frog tanks with sort of all the different color, that is a beautiful presentation. Denver Zoo for many years had one of those, and I think all the things were from different genera, and I don't know that they would even have the capacity then of producing, and all of those things weren't the goal was not reproduction. So I don't know if they were just even disposing of those eggs. I don't remember, what the context would be, but certainly, that presentation, to your point, it's not as big, right? We're talking about little frogs and whatever, but man, just visually stunning. And always that was a crowd pleaser in the zoo, walking through the
people
area.
Are crowded around.
Inevitably, people crowded around it because there's just literal rainbow of frogs that are, and all these bold frogs that are super willing to display all these different colors, all these things. It's truly amazing. And if you're talking about engendering love and excitement for reptiles and amphibians, I mean, that to me would go to your point of saying, like, just the visual on that, as opposed to saying, okay, we could be talking about some reclusive obligate egg feeder, that essentially it's empty tank syndrome, but this is the rarest frog that we have, or whatever, this sort of thing. And it's like, but everyone, general public, cares about that hopping tank of rainbow, that it's just like, wow, you don't need the context there. That's maybe the answer, right? Is on those big displays tanks. Often you don't need the context. You don't need to know what they are. You don't need to know where they come from. You don't need to be bringing with you that information. It's so visually stunning that you have to take it with amazement.
Yeah. And I think, too, that could draw people in to learn more about where they come from and what they are. And, they're really cutting down their forests out there. Maybe I should not support, it's things that contribute to that or something. So it's kind of a two-edged sword when you have things that are visually appealing in a setting that draws people in and gets people excited. And I think, I don't know. There's been a few instances of that I remember pretty vividly in my life where, I was I think I mentioned this on Alan and Ron's episode, but I was in the Berlin Zoo and there was a tank or a pretty good size enclosure, probably a 20 by 20 foot room with a bunch of trees, and they had like 15 frilled lizards, and the lizards were running from tree to tree and climbing and interacting and all sorts of stuff. I sat in front of that tank for, probably 30 minutes to an hour, just staring and watching the frilled lizards run around and interact and hunt and climb. And it was really cool. And now if you had that size of a cage and you had one frilled lizard in it, he'd probably just be sitting up on the side of the tree and not doing much, and so, and I think at certain times frilled lizards can be the most dramatic lizards out there, but most of the time they're just being cryptic. They're just sitting still and hoping not to get noticed. And that doesn't mix well with a zoo. And, whereas dart frogs are out and bold and jumping around and during the day. So they make a really good display animal. So I think taking those things into consideration, housing things like dart frogs with things maybe like an emerald tree boa or something that comes from the same area that doesn't ever move, just kind of sits there, especially during the day, and then kind of swapping that and seeing them at night, and they're cruising around looking for food and things, where the dart frogs are kind of hunkered down and sleeping for the night. So, it'd be interesting to have some of those dual or multiple species enclosures, if you could adjust the light cycles there, so you could come in, kind of have the best of both worlds. You come in the morning and it's, daylight hours, and then you come in the afternoon and it's nighttime hours or something, you can see the things active at night. One of my favorite zoos is Omaha, where the Henry Dorley Zoo, where they have that really expansive, the Desert Dome, and then below the Desert Dome is like the night, whatever, Creatures of the Night exhibit or whatever, where they have like a huge cave with bats flying around, and they have like a bayou with alligators, and it's like dark down there during the daytime, and then they turn the lights on at night. So you're able to see alligators, displaying nocturnal activity, and frogs and turtles and stuff, what they're doing at night. So it's kind of neat that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it really reminds me, and I think that's a great point. It reminds me of my room where I have, the red bulbs as the fixture in the room, and that it's, half the stuff I keep is nocturnal and half the stuff's diurnal. So, I have the glass displays with the rhinos and stuff. They'll get a little bit crepuscular and even, into a couple hours of nocturnal in like midsummer, very hottest part of midsummer. But generally speaking, a diurnal animal that's out in the middle of the day, out doing stuff, basking, doing their different activities. And then essentially all the rest of the room is nocturnal. So there's like one half of the room, the light, when the LEDs above the rhinos turn off, then, now it's everyone else's time to shine, they're all excited and ready to go. And with the red bulbs, you're not, throwing off their cycle, and you can come in, and it's amazing that literally during the day, for the most part, it's one half is empty cages and the other has, these beautiful green snakes that are sitting out. And then when that swaps, all those cages that previously were empty, have snakes hanging down looking to take a meal, and everything else, the rhinos are hidden away. I have one that likes to sleep out, but for the most part, they like to hide away. But I mean, it's amazing. And having that, I don't have any situations set up right now in terms of space and logistics and all that to have that happen in one space. But I can tell you how magical that is in a room. In this instance, they're not actually exposed to one another. But I mean, it's awesome that it's like you go in there any time of year, any time of day or night, and something will be doing something. Yeah. And that is, what more could you ask for? To me, it's the big bummer of, sort of the monoculture aspect where people, they only have this one thing. And it's, what do you, it's not even necessary. I mean, I do think there has to be some sort of knock-on effect to the person themselves, but really we see the biggest bummer is like, what's a bigger bummer than like, it's, someone who has ball pythons in tubs and someone comes over to their house and is like, I want to see snakes. Like that is not conducive at all. Yeah. Right. To saying that person's just, then it's no wonder everyone wants them to be differently colored and painted and whatever, is because that's the part that makes it fun, is you open them and be like, look at this one. This one's white. This one's purple. This one's yellow, whatever. They have to be different because that's the thing that, makes them different. And all of it involves like opening a tub and taking a look. And I don't mean to knock that. I'm just saying to recognize the contrast of like, no, you walk in and depending on whatever time of day or night, something's doing something, but there's never a time when they're all doing something, it's sort of, it's really interesting.
And I think that goes, I mean, it is neat in zoos to see things like a gaboon viper or things, but those sedentary snakes that don't really move, it's fun to kind of try to spot them amongst the leaves. But then when you've spotted them, that's kind of the end of it. They're not going to do really anything or do much, while you're sitting there watching them, or while people are walking past. They might move around at night, or you might catch them crawling around. But so, having the opportunity to see them, but then also see other things maybe interacting or moving around them or climbing over top of them or something would be kind of a neat thing too. But the fact that you have, and I guess, the way people keep green tree pythons in captivity is kind of conducive to just having them sit on a stick in front of the, right in the middle of the cage. And, if they don't really have to move or do anything to get fed pretty consistently, so they don't really do much, whereas in the wild, they're climbing up a tree and down a tree. I always thought it would be really cool to have a spiral staircase that went around kind of a tubular enclosure with a big tree or two or three in the middle of it, where the green trees could climb up and down and move from tree to tree and stuff, and see kind of what they did and where they went and that kind of thing. See the whole life cycle, and maybe glean some information on what they might be doing in the wild, because there's still a lot of stuff that's not known. So if you're giving them those more naturalistic setups, maybe the available or the opportunity to observe those naturalistic behaviors increases. Whereas if they're in a 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot, what are you expecting to see? It's basically just kind of a production cage or a cage for ease or ease of maintenance. And, not a lot bad may happen in that cage system. You're not going to have them fall out of a tree or, I don't know, hide away somewhere where they can't get out, or things like that might occur if you're doing something for the first time in a big enclosure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so this raises to me raises to me another issue that you brought up earlier, right? In terms of the context of giving those bigger cages, it can facilitate sort of those species that cover longer distances, right? Mm-hmm. And that what that looks like in terms of, okay, how, you're giving them, it's still not 100 yards, but at least it's a little bit closer or whatever. And so I do think there's some aspect of that makes sense. The thing that jumps out to me when we were talking through that is I just listened to a couple different podcasts that kind of hit on this topic, and just more so, that's not to say there aren't species where that's the case, but just the variability in that. And again, maybe that speaks to what you're putting where and how you're keeping them. Mm-hmm. Is that so I was listening to the Herpetological Highlights podcast where they mm-hmm. talked about essentially moving fidelity to home ranges in dart frogs again, right? And so they were moving them 10 meters, 20 meters, and 40 meters. Mm-hmm. And these are they're not thumbnails, but I think they were tinctoria, something like a couple inch long frogs, and they were then trying to induce or seeing what would happen if they then put inducements into the environment, either pseudo alternative males, actual calls from other males, these sorts of stimuli to see what mm-hmm. they would do. And they had a remarkable fidelity to a specific spot. And it didn't seem like actually those other potential stimuli or inducements really made much of an impact. But the point was that it was something like, I think at 20 meters, 98% of those that they sampled all wound up back where they started within a day, something like that. And even the 40 meters, it was still 90%, something like that. It was incredibly high, and with mm-hmm. this very defined small range. Well, that fits as being, kind of cuts both ways, right? It fits as being something that would probably do well, being loyal to that small space, fits as something that would do well in a smaller environment. Mm-hmm. At the same time, as I'm saying that, right, in the context of the hopping rainbow, that might not be great, right? If we're talking about something that's that loyal to their home space, the idea of kind of crowding that space mm-hmm. with all these, let alone other species, whether they're from that, especially if they're not exactly, they're all from Colombia. Well, sort of, but that means a whole lot of different things, right? What that actually looks like. Right. So what does that do? Is there a stress impact? That's where you're going to have to be super responsive to how they're actually acting and interacting. Mm-hmm. But so I did want to bring that up, and you had actually sort of re-brought up the topic. So I really appreciate that. The other one that it reminds me of, and I'm going to get this mostly wrong. Maybe you can help me with some of it. So the new gecko-related podcast, Gecko Time? Is that maybe? I
don't know that I've listened to it yet. I guess
okay. Nipper has pitched it. He had been listening to it. I hadn't heard of it. He pitched it in the smaller chat, right? He had sent it and said, hey, or he'd sent it out of saying, hey, what about, this one was great or whatever. And I was like, I wasn't even familiar with it. And that was probably maybe 8 or 10 episodes in. And now they've, doubled that or whatever. But they were talking to the person from, I believe it's the online magazine, Exotic Keeper magazine. When we were in Vegas, on the back end of the trip, we were listening. This is the fellow who had gone to New Caledonia to try and find crested geckos in the wild. Yeah. So they were talking to him. on the one that just came out. And as part of that conversation, there was a discussion around, I think he'd spoken with the scientists, and I could be getting this wrong. I could be conflating this with some other podcast that I'd listened to today, but I don't think so, because of this second piece was, they mentioned in there, right, that they were mentioning Phil as a friend of theirs, which is great, and talking about how he's friends with the researcher in Australia tracking Nephrurus, and how they're, put little tracker backpacks on them, and they were going 100 yards a night or whatever. So I'm pretty confident it's this show. But there was a mention made there of saying there was some scientific study where literally sort of year after year, oh, you can find this animal in this tree. This sort of, so again, talking about fidelity and tight range versus species with more expansive ranges and all those things. And, so again, fitting into maybe one, I guess it really just speaks to amenability to be into sort of singular smaller cages, or to be in where there is a benefit. Yeah, a frilled lizard. I mean, it's hard to imagine you could make a cage big enough that you would overexert them, especially on an adult, right? An established adult that's comfortable with your routine. It's hard to imagine you could overdo it. Yeah, sure. You probably wouldn't want to toss a hatchling in a 40 by 40 cage in your backyard. Yeah, that probably won't end well. Especially not acclimatized to your setup, what you're doing, how you're trying to encourage it, all those things. But, just in terms of potential for activity, exactly what you said, it could use that whole space, but if it was sitting there by itself, it also probably is just going to sit on the side of a tree. And if there's, a bird flies overhead, then maybe it'll turn to the other side of the tree. Yeah. But that's about it.
Yeah. It would be, it is kind of hard, that balance between wanting to be, I hesitate to use the word entertain, but that's kind of what people are looking at from a zoo perspective, is they want to go see animals do crazy things, or that kind of thing. So in that aspect, a frilled dragon is probably not a great display animal, although unless there's a way to get them to be on the right side of the tree where everybody can see them, kind of thing. Like, I don't know if you have like
that's where the spotlight is, or there's some,
exactly.
You have the shadow puppet on the backside of it to discourage the backside. Yeah.
There's probably plenty of examples of, that. I looked it up. I think the podcast is the Gecko Exchange podcast.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, pretty new. But yeah, I need to check that out. I'll mark that as a favorite and start listening. But the other thing I think I wanted to mention in regards to range, home range, and that kind of thing. I was watching a nature documentary on big cats in Africa, and they were talking about leopards. These leopards, they found that they spend 40% of their time maintaining that range, like going and scent marking different trees and just making sure that nobody's coming into their range, and marking that range and letting other cats know this is my territory, kind of thing, which was kind of interesting to think about. Like 40% of the time is spent monitoring the range. If you don't give them an area big enough, or they're not going to do that. I doubt they're doing that in captivity, where it's almost like okay, I'm in this place and I'm with this other animal, or either I'm going to get along or I'm not. There's no sense trying to maintain a range, because we're just overlapping, and you never know what kind of stress that puts on, different animals, where they're programmed to maintain and monitor this area that's theirs, and if something else comes in there, that's either fight or flight kind of time. So maybe something like a dart frog, you could do that in a captive setting with a large enough space. You could have different, colonies. And I always thought that would be really cool to have, even, you could even do this in your house, have like a fairly large potted tree, and then have another one across the room, and have, veiled or panther chameleons or something, where they can see each other. Maybe the male's up on top or displaying towards each other, but they're all kind of contained in this one tree. I don't know if that's even feasible, but that'd be kind of a cool thing. And I'm sure there's plenty of different species that would be more conducive to such a thing, where you could let them establish a range, or have multiple males in a given area that typically would just kill each other if they were in a small enough enclosure, but given enough space could actually have more naturalistic behavior.
Right. The argument of beneficial stress, right? That especially exactly. There is some, right, that there's some level of that is natural, and actually the removal of that, well, it's kind of killing with kindness, right? Or the potential for that, if we're saying, okay, we're diminishing their capacity by never exposing any of that stress at all, right? It's the whole, zebras don't get ulcers because they're not worried about stuff beyond sort of the imperative moment. But, in the absence of any imperative moment, is that actually diminishment in itself,
Yeah. There's such a thing as good stress. And I think those kind of things keep them driven to do certain things, whether it be battle for mates or, like if they're just given mates,
protect their territory, whatever it might be. Yeah.
They become a lazy, fat, breeder, whatever. They don't do as well or something. They have all the food they need. There's no drive. There's no competition. There's no anything. So, and of course that's a hard thing in captivity because we want everything to survive and everything to be happy and that kind of thing. But you wonder if that's even a possible outcome in nature, because there is so much, cruelty and death and destruction and fighting and, that kind of thing in nature. So, I don't know, if there was another statistic I heard, I can't even remember which species. Oh, it was lions. I think they said only, a very small percentage, like 15 or 6 to 15%, somewhere around there, of babies make it to adulthood. And that's a lot of dead lion babies, it's kind of sad to think about, but that's the reality of nature, and especially for, a lot of the reptiles, I'm sure 90% or more, of
anything with big litters, right? They're like that for a reason.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, and the ones that are kind of weak or not doing that great, they're going to get picked off very first and fastest. And, that's just the way it goes. So sometimes I wonder, if we're limping these wimpy, genetic, animals along and that's, kind of anti-nature, but oh, well, that's what we do. We like the struggling, the underdog, I guess we root for the underdog to survive and do well. But I think, I don't know. I still like the idea of someday having that walk-in enclosure where I can just go sit on a bench and watch a bunch of lizards interact, that kind of thing. Then again, maybe I satisfy that in my herping adventures and try to increase the size of the caging and, to a more realistic, or closer to, ideal for the animal, while, not giving them my entire house to have the run of, or, and, there are definitely challenges with some of these larger setups and outdoor setups and things like that, where, like you said, half the time you're trying to probably protect them from the environment that they are adapted to, because if they're enclosed in a smaller area rather than just given the lay of the land, they may not do well in that area and they're going to cook in the sun or, not have a place to escape like they need it. So I think the more we know about their natural history, the better we can try to solve those problems or meet those concerns and keep them successfully. But I think a lot of us it's difficult. It's hard, to keep them in those larger naturalistic setups as compared with a controlled tub or a 2x2x2 cube. So
absolutely.
I don't know. Did we? Anything else you're dying to hit on, or did we kind of cover the topic?
No, I think we covered it pretty good. I think there were honestly, I think your opening salvo was great because it really tossed out all the ideas that I think we came through and discussed. An excellent thesis statement. I thought they're persuasive points to either side. It's really, as ever, people will be disappointed. It's all about context. And I think there's a compelling case for either side, depending on your utility, what's your planned utility and who's your planned audience and all that.
Right.
But
yeah, good stuff. Well, thanks. Yeah, that was fun to discuss. I don't know. I'm excited to go see more stuff in the wild. I think when it comes down to it, it is, cheap imitation that we have going in our captive environments, cheap imitation of nature. And it is really cool to see them out. And the more I see things in the wild, the more I want to up my game, I guess, in captivity and do a little better, keep them. So, they maybe resemble their wild counterparts a little bit more, but yeah, that's the dream, I guess. But then again, I'm kind of, I don't know, you get busy or lazy or whatever, and things, you're not moving as quickly as you'd like sometimes. And I guess, that is maybe a point to say, do it up front, start out with, you love it when people say, well, how small can I keep them in right now? You're right. Like, well, that attitude's going to get you into trouble later on, but I've fallen into that too, that idea of the 90s, keep 50 million reptiles in a warehouse in a rack system, and that's the ideal of success, and I think we need to get away from that. And I still think there's maybe a little too much of that rattling around in my head, but racks serve a purpose in a lot of ways. And, especially with baby snakes, if you're hatching out 50 baby snakes, you're going to run out of room real quick if you're trying to keep them in room size enclosures. But
yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, any other really cool things on your mind this week in regards to herpetoculture or herpetology in general? Yeah.
So, I received gifts from both Phil and Nipper, anonymous gifts. Uh-huh. I got so Phil sent The Explorers by Tim Flannery, which is a book. Essentially, it's a collection of, can I make this work? Australian sort of anecdotes from explorers who visited Australia, from when Europeans started going there forward. Okay. Yeah. It's really interesting. So I've just sort of dug into that. That's pretty cool. Mm-hmm. And Nipper sent a book that so this was interesting. So he had found an old Zoology of Colorado, which he I guess this was the book that he had purchased, and he had highlighted as being notable as being older than he is. And also included was the first edition of the Amphibians and Reptiles of Colorado. So I've only ever had the second edition of this and the Hammerson book. And so I had assumed that was the intended item, and that maybe the zoology one was the toss-in or whatever. But apparently it was vice versa. That it was just sort of optimism that I would like the reptile book based on the receipt of the zoology book. And certainly, both have been, it's, the freebie, you couldn't get a better freebie for sure. And the zoology one, super fun, especially, man, someone was just mentioning this, but I think there's a lot of truth to it is, the utility of being, and I know you're always more this way than I am, but being a general naturalist rather than just being into snakes, let alone reptiles or snakes and monitors. And, that's basically it or whatever, and geckos or whatever. And that's it. I know when Phil and I were in Texas, man, so many mammals going, and then that made the second badger that I'd seen in 6 weeks or whatever. And mammals are pretty cool too. I'm not turning into Owen over here, but nonetheless, mammals are pretty cool too. So really cool to just kind of always trying to keep an open mind, learn more about it, see how there's so much amazing stuff. And I think all too often we get in our own little boxes, and even then we carry all those preconceived biases with us. Oh, that's an inexpensive reptile, it can't be cool. And it's like, and I was looking at my 14-year-old leopard gecko just going, these things are really cool. I'm hearing the guy I think his name's Tim, right, who went to find crested geckos in the wild, and he's talking about it, and I'm like, that would be really cool to go to New Caledonia, Isle of Pines, go find a crested gecko. That'd be pretty darn cool. Whereas for sure. if you go see them at a reptile show, it's sort of a dime a dozen. Not notable and whatever. But just sort of the visceral response that was creating in me. It's like, man, that's really cool, and that's a nothing burger of a captive reptile or whatever. But it's just like, wow, like that would be amazing. So
I can't remember where to hear this, so I'll probably get in trouble with it. But there was somebody talking about the fact that lychees in the wild live on. Maybe this was still at Reptilandia, but they were talking about lychees in the wild live on smooth bark trees, but everybody keeps them on cork bark because that's what's available, and that's what's easy to work with. So, they were talking about, if you have a gecko that's designed or evolved to live on smooth bark trees, and then you're keeping it on cork bark, what's that doing to the gecko? And no wonder they're always on the glass.
On the glass. No, I think, where was, because I heard the same thing.
Might have been a podcast.
It was. I just heard the same thing. Yeah. So it must have been, some podcast, because I heard that same sort of commentary, and it made a ton of sense. And simultaneously, so in this same episode, the New Caledonia thing, I guess the observation has been, or was in this context, that they're utilizing not only for the cresteds, they're using, unsurprisingly thin, small branched, smooth branched stuff, but horizontally, right? Because that was the big thing, right? Is always this perpetual conversation of most, I think all of the wild caught ones that they had were the stub tail, right? Where they lost their tails and those sorts of things. And I don't know if this is still an issue, but on those that don't lose their tails in captivity, they can get deformity in it based on how they commonly rest or whatever. If they're resting on the glass, that this could cause issues and, sort of progressive malformation, these sorts of things. And so when I heard that line about, all the ones that he was spotting were actually lying on a horizontal branch or on, some angle of horizontal branch. And I don't even know if it was all of them or whatever, but certainly, some amount of them were in that position. It was like exactly to that same point of, not only is it cork bark versus glass, you're then in a space of like, if they're, because the glass situation, they're then vertical rather than horizontal. What is that doing? Literally the pressure on their structures that could cause that malformation over time. Just fascinating.
Yeah. Just things you don't really think about unless somebody's making those observations. And if nobody's going to look for them, or, very few people that don't talk about it are looking for them, then you're going to wind into those, those misconceptions or, I remember Alan Rapashi telling a story about the first generation of those crested geckos when, the ones that they bred initially. He said like a cat got into the gecko warehouse or whatever, and just the cat, meowed or something, and all of a sudden he heard a rain of tails. Like they just dropped their tails, and it's like that was the first generation of crested geckos, and it's kind of bred out of them because people like them to have tails. But like the majority of crested geckos in the wild don't have tails, so it's kind of an interesting thing that way. And if they drop them at the meow of a cat, then that's probably an interesting defense mechanism that only works once because they don't regrow their tails. Right. I just thought that was really curious, especially where they're a little bit prehensile, where they're using them to hold on. And, you'd think,
I think the question was kind of, so easy? Well, that became the question, right? Is there actually like a hidden utility to dropping it? So despite, is the prehensile nature, is that a retained feature rather than a developed feature in them based on their common ancestry? Sure. And actually I think, there was some discussion around like, does it actually help their physiology, either their structures or their ability to jump, their sort of form, so to speak, by not having a tail? Is their actual preferred state the absence of a tail? The fact that all the ones in the wild and have this super willingness to drop them. We love the look. It looks so clean and whatever. They need to have their tail. Oh, this is imperfect. It doesn't have its tail, right? We've seen plenty of that. But if actually the evolved state is the propensity to drop it because it actually makes them more ecologically fit relative to their form. Right. Super interesting. Obviously this is almost an unknowable, but it's super interesting to sort of invert the idea, right? We have this preconception, and actually the evolved state might actually be a propensity to drop it because it situates them better to move about their environment.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really cool to think about and to, kind of, see if we're in need of a paradigm shift, and if we should start, keeping horizontal branches that are smooth in our crested gecko enclosures and things, those kind of things. That's the beneficial part of this, that, when people make these observations, that we take that into account and try to change up what we're doing. Now, again, if you're keeping 50 pairs of crested geckos and you have 100 lizards and you have to redo all the enclosures, that can be a bit of a challenge. So, I guess that's the thing that we're in. I guess I think about Ron St. Pierre, where he's having to redo enclosures all the time because he miscalculated something or didn't think about something and it didn't work the way he thought it would, or the animals weren't using it the correct, the way he'd planned. And so he has to redo them and, start over again, or there's a big tree blocking, so he has to move and build somewhere else, those kind of things. Yeah. And that's just the nature of the beast. If you're trying your best to do what's right for the animals, you're going to run into that. You're going to be changing things and evolving and improving as you go. So, yep. Well, I think I'm going to announce this, and if anybody's still listening, you get to hear this first, I guess. But Nipper and I have been working on a field guide to the reptiles and amphibians of Utah, and we're nearing completion there. So, I'm pretty excited. It kind of came about a little bit that way, where Nipper was coming over to Herp in Utah, and he's like, "Why isn't there a Utah field guide?" And I said, "Oh, there is." And he's like, "No, there isn't." I'm like, "Oh, I didn't know that." And so he's like, "Well, why don't we write one?" Okay, let's do it. And so we started writing one, kind of, I guess, naively a little bit, because, I still haven't seen all the species of Utah. I still have a few snake species and a few amphibian, frog and toad species that I haven't seen in the wild, and then one lizard. So I'm almost there with the lizards, but the others are, and a couple of turtles, mostly invasive stuff. I think I've seen all the native turtles, which is like a whole 2 or 3. So that's a little easier. And I've seen all the salamanders of Utah. Yeah, I have done that several times. I've got quite a few cool localities to add to the book. But so this is kind of going to deviate a little bit from the typical one picture range map, short description and done. It's a little more involved. It talks, has a description, but I'm going to Nipper and I are including 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 pictures, depending on the species, to show kind of diversity across the range. So I always hated when they just show one picture, like this is what they look like. No, there's quite a bit of variability in reptiles and amphibians a lot of times. So I want to see, the range of what they could look like, depending on where you're finding them. So that'll be part of this. We'll have, a section on how to find them. So, if you're in Utah looking to photograph some native wildlife, maybe it'll give you a few hints and tips to find the different species. So, hopefully it'll be well received. I know, every time you write a book, you hear, or hear from others, "Oh, I'm working on that too." Like I'm writing a book too. And, and I think there are probably a lot of people who could write a better field guide than I can, but I'm going to put something out there, and everybody's definitely encouraged and able to write their own book. And I think I would buy a different field guide than the one I wrote. So I think there's room for multiple books in the same area. I mean, I'm anxious to get Scott and Ty's new Snakes of Australia book, even though I've got other, field guides to the reptiles of Australia. And I may not take it out in the field because I want to have all the species of reptile and reptile at least to be able to ID stuff in the field. But, I definitely have a lot of different Australian field guides and books on different reptiles from Australia. So, again, there's always room for more books, so don't hesitate to write your own and get it out there. But, hopefully we'll have it, here towards the end of the year. I still, we're about to the, photo layout stage. So we're gathering photos. And so if you have some photos of more rare, reptiles and amphibians in Utah, then reach out and let me know, and maybe we can include one of your photos in the guidebook. I prefer that the photo was taken in Utah. That would be preferred, and the county, at least the county locality, and then we'll kind of select photos from there. Once I have a number of photos, I can kind of pick the top 4 or 5 that represent the different phenotypes across the range or whatever, or at least show individuals from different parts of the range. That's kind of the goal. So we're short, mostly on frogs and toads, have less pictures than I might like, and also of the turtles. We have a ton of snake photos for the most part. Maybe a few like the thread snake. We're a little light on photos of thread snakes, but other than that, like I think milk snakes. Rye Jones provided a ton of amazing photos from all across the range. He's probably found more milk snakes than any. Yeah, maybe Brian Eager might give him a run for his money. But so cool to see, from 8 different counties, different, milk snakes from 8 different counties. It's pretty cool. So I don't know, excited to have another project close to being done, wrapping things up.
Absolutely.
And hopefully it's worth people's time to check it out. But I know it's going to be published under Eco by Bob Ashley, so that's exciting. He's got some contacts with the national parks and state parks and things. So that's always been a dream to have a book, in a national park in Utah.
Next time we walk in,
yeah. So hopefully that'll be the case. But yeah, so I don't know. Hopefully we'll get this done. By I'm shooting kind of for Christmas time, but that might be a little ambitious, especially with leaving for Australia in a couple weeks. That's getting close. Yeah. I'm getting very excited and anxious to get out there. Yeah. Cool deal. So I don't know. Reptiles and Amphibians of Utah field guide should be out hopefully soon.
Awesome.
Good times. All right. Well, I guess that does it. We'll thank Eric and Owen and the Morelia Python radio family, and we'll catch you again next week for another episode of Reptile Fight Club.